So I wanted to talk about Carlos Castaneda. It's 2018. I'm 60 years old. I'm a lawyer. I was in a meeting yesterday with some other people. It was, of all places, a police merit board a meeting, and a curious thing happened. Carlos Castaneda came up in conversation. Maybe it's not so curious. For those of you who don't know, Carlos Castaneda was the author of a series of books starting with a Yaqui way of knowledge. It was published in 1968 or 69. It started out as a thesis for his studies at UCLA in anthropology. After a lot of maneuvering, it was thought to be a fascinating field work by a young graduate anthropology student, and touted as publishable. It was publishable. It published and resulted in a huge success for the author, Carlos Castaneda. The book is very unusual because came along at a very perfect time in social history. Of course, 1968, 69, we had the Beatles, and we were looking at a society that was in transition and change. The drugs were a big part of that change. Acid or LSD, more prevalently pot, which was widespread, and of course it became a feature of the 70s and the decade after. But it was in that milieu that this book appeared, and it was latched onto it by a lot of people who were experiencing sort of altered states of reality in their intoxication with drugs. And this altered state of reality was different from alcohol intoxication. It seemed to have its own mystical side, a sort of mysterious side. And the book fit into that perfectly because the book is presented as a way that the young anthropology student is going to do a field study on the use of medicinal herbs, including peyote, by Native Americans, both in South United States and Mexico. And he finds us in a very romantically, or in a way that would be romantic in 1960s. He meets with this old shaman, a brujo, as he calls him, Don Juan Matus, in the bus stop in Prescott, Arizona, right outside or off the desert. And that leads to an invitation to come hook up with Don Matus, which is the name of the Indian. And he proves to be a very unusual person. We later learn, by his own description, a sorcerer. And this is not a medicine man. This is not I guess perhaps would be a shaman, but actually sorcery is what it's talking about. And Carlos Castaneda takes us, and that's a perfect name, by the way, I think, for this person, this guide, this trickster, Carlos Castaneda. The name almost seems sort of has sort of a mystical side to it. He takes us into this world of the sorcerer and learning about what is a completely different world from the one that most people commonly experience. And the whole lesson of all these books is that the world that we experience in our normal, sober life is simply the world that has been taught to us from the childhood through adulthood. And the whole point of sorcery is to learn to see the reality beyond the illusions that have been agreed upon by the world. Now, if you studied anything or follow interests or have an interest in consciousness studies or um, physics at the quantum level, you can start seeing all sorts of interesting resonances in those fields of knowledge that have been developed since the 20th century, or in the 20th century and coming forward to the present. Um, so um, I think it's curious to see that we are still dealing with some of these things, or that it is still appearing as a relevant, although a footnote to those times, at least is enough to appear in conversation between two lawyers at a police merit board hearing. It's interesting. I think it was Salon magazine published an interesting article about the aftermath of that publishing event and phenomenon of Carlos Castaneda writing these books on sorcery in the last year or two of 1969 and the first few years of 1970s. Back in, I don't know, a few decades ago, I'd heard this, but I took some time to look at it more carefully. After his success, Carlos Castaneda initial success, he continued to publish some books, and I read some of them. I used to read them I remember reading them when they were emerging, and I got the definite sense that the original passion, vision, interesting thing about them was gone. He was phoning in his work, and but the first three books are pretty remarkable. And I say it this way: not only is the topic very remarkable, but it's also remarkable in the quality of the writing. He's an excellent writer, and he sets many scenes that are, even though otherworldly, we might say, they're beautifully written, beautifully described. And he's got a scene, I think it's in Journey to Ixtlan, where he's with Don Juan Matus in Mexico City in a park, and they witness the death of I guess a peasant several yards away. The crowd gathers around, the sun's setting, and this is all a set piece as Don Juan Matus is talking about his view of life, and he's appearing in this setting, although we tend to get a picture of Don Juan Matus as sort of a rural, rustic peasant. In this piece, he appears in Mexico City urban center in a perfectly tailored, beautiful suit of first quality materials, looking splendid. And part of his discussion is that by doing so, he is able to appear in any guise because he's mastered not only his world, but our world. But this writing in this particular piece is wonderful. And the later pieces fall off, and as he writes other books about, they just turn to crap, it seems to me. And I lost interest in it because the writing sucked. But in the Salon article, it's a very good article, and they take a look at the people around him. If you go on YouTube, you can find some scenes from a group that he developed, or a program he developed called Tensingati. It's a phrase that he stole from Buckminster Fuller to describe what it was, the process thing that they were doing. And something called Clear Green, which was an organization that ran his program. But he himself, Castaneda, withdrew from public life and withdrew from the world, so to speak. Now, there's a couple of things you think of here. One was he was creating a cloak of mystery about himself that was ideal for him, who, by the way, in this books, he becomes an apprentice to the sorcerer, and then becomes a sorcerer himself. So he disappears, which would be something you'd expect a wizard to do, sorcerer. Um, but the other topic that sort of dashed all that was sorcerers are not supposed to weaken or get sick. Castaneda got weak, he got sick, he had liver cancer and died in 1998. When he died, the information wasn't released in a normal way. He was cremated, and there's no obituary, no public announcement of this very public figure, or I should say, formerly public figure. And a few days after his death, 4 of the women around him, with very unusual names, were devotees. Certainly what we would think of as normal people would think of as cult devotees. They disappeared, vanished. All their phone systems were cut off, and they were simply not heard from again. They've never been found. Nobody knows where they are. Now, one of the women that was following him, I forget her name, it was Parton. She was earlier described as the Blue Scout, a very special, one of his acolytes in their little group. Her vehicle was found weeks later in the middle of Death Valley. But she was not found anywhere. Then in 2003, so 3 or 4 years later, some hikers in the desert came upon some skeletal remains, and these have been determined to be Miss Parton's skeleton. So this all very, and the other 4 women, of course, we haven't heard from, as I said, their disappearance, her disappearance, the location of her remains has all created quite a mystery for a person who called himself a sorcerer. So that's my first video log on a topic of interest, prompted by discussion at a police mayor board hearing.